Carlton's hand began to burn after he touched the stones of fallen souls, and James recoiled in shock. Alarmed, he asked Carlton if the stones were responsible for this. Carlton confirmed it, explaining that only members of the Nak Myung family could handle the stones without consequences. Nak Myung's descendants were the sole people capable of carrying them without becoming contaminated. Yet here was Jae-hwan, clearly not part of Nak Myung's lineage, and he had handled the stones effortlessly. James, still unsettled, questioned how they could trust Jae-hwan. Carlton, not fully convinced, replied that it wasn't about trust but perhaps something deeper. He believed Jae-hwan's soul might be the key. Remember when the scanner malfunctioned while trying to measure his spirit contamination? Carlton asked. James nodded, recalling the error that had confused him earlier. The gauge malfunctioned, but that's supposed to be impossible, Carlton continued. James was stunned, wondering how such a thing could have happened. Carlton offered one explanation: Jae-hwan's soul was purer than any other in chaos. James found this hard to believe, but Carlton wasn't concerned whether Jae-hwan was from Nak Myung or not. What mattered was that Jae-hwan could handle the stones. Carlton believed this issue should be brought to the inner council, leaving it up to them to decide Jae-hwan's fate. James speculated whether Jae-hwan's presence might be tied to their lord's recent predicament, but Carlton wasn't certain. Before they parted ways, Carlton turned to James, his gaze sharp. "I heard you accepted a bribe to let someone in, just because Mino dropped a name." James stiffened, fear prickling his skin. Inside the fortress, Jae-hwan found himself wandering through unfamiliar streets, feeling out of place. Mino was supposed to lead him, but instead, he was left to carry the burden of navigating the town. He recalled Carlton's parting words to Mino, reminding her to bring her certificate next time, and quoting the Gorgon Entry Law, Article 7, Paragraph 34, those without proper documentation or with falsified certificates would be denied entry and face severe penalties. Despite her offense, Carlton had spared her because Jae-hwan had intervened, urging him to go easy on her. He had also reminded Mino that bribes were strictly forbidden under Article 11, Paragraph 6, which punished both the giver and receiver of any kind of inducement to enter the town. Carlton's constant lecturing on the laws grated on Mino's nerves, and she finally snapped, telling him she'd had enough. Jae-hwan chuckled inwardly, thinking Carlton's legal code skill was more of an annoyance than a real threat. As they walked away, Carlton wished Jae-hwan a good stay in Gorgon, but Jae-hwan still found the inspector a bit of a nuisance. Not long after, Jae-hwan spotted a man and approached him, asking for directions to a skilled blacksmith. He specifically wanted someone capable of handling a spirit sword like his. The man hesitated, unsure, while another figure lurking beneath the bridge eyed Jae-hwan's sword with malicious intent, clearly interested. Just then, Mino bumped into Jae-hwan, snapping out of her daze. She asked him how they had gotten into the town, as if everything that had happened earlier was a blur to her. Jae-hwan glanced at Mino and asked if she was feeling better, then nonchalantly suggested it was time for her to find her own way. Mino was taken aback and quickly pleaded with him to wait, asking how he could just toss her aside like that. She hurried after him, apologizing for leaving him at the town's entrance earlier and claiming it was all just a joke. Jae-hwan sighed, explaining that she had already done enough by bringing him to the town, and anything more would just weigh him down. Looking directly at her, he added that he could see her soul was damaged. Their paths, he said, were different, and it was time for them to part ways. Mino clenched her fists, clearly angered, and rushed forward. Frustrated, she told him that he didn't know anything about this place and could easily get into trouble. Surprised by her persistence, Jae-hwan reassured her that he could always ask for directions if needed. But Mino wouldn't back down, insisting that he should rely on her because she knew the area better than anyone else. After a moment of silence, Jae-hwan finally mentioned that he was searching for a dream demon. Mino's expression softened, and she offered to lead him to one, as she had an idea of where to find it. Jae-hwan agreed, but just as he reached into his bag to grab his sword, he noticed a group of strangers eyeing them. He looked at Mino and told her that first, they needed to deal with the troublemakers surrounding them. The gang of thugs who had been eavesdropping on their conversation began closing in, smirking as if they had finally cornered their target. The gang leader turned to one of his men and asked if this was the guy with the glowing sword they had heard about. The man quickly denied ever mentioning anything about a glowing sword. Mino, visibly annoyed, stepped forward and demanded to know who these losers were. She gave them a sharp warning to back off before they regretted crossing her. The leader chuckled, clearly amused by her fiery attitude, and remarked that the red-haired girl certainly had some spirit. But with a sneer, he advised her to watch her tongue before saying something she'd regret. One of the gang members, visibly angry, clenched his fists. Another, more composed, chuckled and explained that their junior had just hit puberty, he was only 12 this year, and his temper flared up whenever someone was rude to him. Besides, he added, it's not polite to speak that way to a growing kid. He then turned to Jaehwan and Mino, warning them to hand over the sword, or his junior would come after them. Another thug chimed in, rambling about how they needed to pay a toll if they wanted to pass through. Jaehwan sighed, realizing they were in for more trouble. Mino, on the other hand, was in shock, her jaw dropping when she heard them refer to the hulking figure as their junior. Frustrated, the giant, who was apparently the youngest in the group, glared at them. He clearly thought they didn't understand who they were dealing with. He demanded they give up the sword, threatening them with harm if they refused. Mino, still astonished, couldn't help but blurt out her disbelief, asking how such a massive guy could be considered a junior. That was all it took to set the man off. With a growl, he lunged at her, declaring it was time for her punishment for speaking out of turn. Just before he could reach her, Jaehwan moved swiftly, drawing his sword and slashing the man's arm in one clean motion, sending him sprawling to the ground. The other gang members froze in shock. Jaehwan, irritated by the endless talking, calmly pointed his sword at them, challenging them to attack if they wanted a fight. Furious that one of their own had been hurt, the gang began cursing him, vowing to make him pay for what he'd done to their precious little junior, who now whimpered in pain, clutching his bleeding arm. The gang leader trembled with rage, unable to believe anyone had dared to harm their beloved junior. Some of the gang members frantically informed the boss that Junior was still alive, though badly hurt. Mino, still stunned, couldn't believe they kept referring to the massive man as their sweet junior. As they rushed forward, eager to exact revenge, Jaehwan remained calm. He raised his sword, and before anyone could land a blow, a sudden burst of energy filled the air. In an instant, the gang members were defeated, blood staining the ground. Jaehwan wiped his blade clean as if it were nothing, while Mino stood there, speechless, clearly impressed by his skill and the effortless way he had handled the situation. Mino couldn't contain her curiosity and asked Jaehwan how he had managed to defeat all those thugs with just a few strikes, impressed by the power behind his moves. Jaehwan, however, casually responded that stabbing was his only skill, which left Mino stunned. She blinked in disbelief, thinking he had to be joking, but he continued, explaining that he knew 3 variations: shallow stab, normal stab, and hard stab. Mino stared at him, trying to wrap her head around it, and thought back to someone she once knew who relied solely on one type of attack as well. That person used slashing techniques instead of stabbing, but it was a similar concept. Jaehwan seemed intrigued by the idea that someone else had mastered a single skill and asked if that was common. Shifting the conversation, Mino asked why his last attack had veered off course and smashed through the roof of a nearby building. This startled Jaehwan, and he looked at her, puzzled. She repeated the question, wondering if he had lost control of his strike. He recalled the moment and explained that during the fight, someone had been using a cloaking ability across the street, which had been distracting him. Annoyed, he had aimed at the roof to scare them off. Mino's eyes widened in disbelief. "You destroyed a roof to scare someone off?" she asked, horrified. Jaehwan seemed confused by her reaction. "Doesn't everyone do that? My comrade, Yunhwan, would have done the same." Mino shook her head in disbelief and suggested that perhaps he should come up with a cool name for his skill, something flashy to match the power behind it. Jaehwan, amused, asked what kind of names she had in mind. She rattled off a few suggestions. "How about Black Flaming Spear? Or maybe Azura's Infinite Spear?" she asked, clearly excited by the dramatic names. Jaehwan immediately dismissed the ideas, telling her that he wasn't a fan of flashy names. Unfazed, Mino suggested simpler ones like Demon Destroyer or Meteor Spear. He smirked and urged her to keep going. As they walked, they passed a street vendor, a cheerful woman welcoming customers as she sold various items. After passing a few more stalls, Mino finally stopped in front of a particular shop with a satisfied expression. She pointed ahead and said, "This is the place, Twilight Smithy." Jaehwan looked up to see the large, impressive building before them. According to Mino, this was no ordinary shop. It had been established by a dream demon, one of the most skilled blacksmiths in all of Gorgon. As Jaehwan and Mino approached the entrance of Twilight Smithy, a voice startled them. A young boy named Naven, a worker at the smithy, greeted them politely, asking if they had come to place an order. Before they could answer, he apologized and warned that even if they did, it might take a while to fulfill. Mino, curious, asked why there was a delay. Naven explained that the head blacksmith was currently away, leaving the deputy blacksmith, Michael Garned, in charge. Unfortunately, Michael was occupied that day, running tests for the apprentices. Naven then suggested they take a look at some of the finished products instead if they were in a hurry to find something. Mino nodded thoughtfully as they were led inside, where they saw the apprentices gathered around a striking sword made from the horns of a four-horned beast. The apprentices were clearly in awe of the weapon's sharpness and craftsmanship. Michael Garnett, the deputy blacksmith, was instructing his workers as they marveled at the sword. He explained that while the blade was already exceptional, it still required a hole in the handle to insert a gem, which would enhance its power. The apprentices, eager for a chance to work on such a valuable piece, immediately volunteered for the task. They viewed it as an incredible opportunity to gain experience handling such a rare material. However, Michael chuckled to himself. He knew how difficult the task really was. Drilling through a four-horned beast's horn was no easy feat. As the workers lined up, ready to try their hand at it, Michael lifted the sword and issued a challenge. "Whoever manages to drill a hole through this horn will be the deputy blacksmith for today," he declared with a grin. One of the apprentices stepped forward confidently, grabbing a hammer and a large nail. He positioned the nail against the horn and struck it with the hammer, but quickly realized the horn's immense toughness. The nail barely made a dent. Frustrated, he stepped aside and handed the tools to another apprentice, who was just as eager to prove himself. The second worker took the hammer and nail, determined to succeed where his colleague had failed. As he prepared to strike, he wondered aloud how Michael had managed to craft the sword from such a stubborn material in the first place. Michael watched in disbelief as his apprentices struggled to even scratch the surface of the four-horned beast's horn. He had hoped they would rise to the challenge of his offer, free reign over the entire smithy for a day if they could drill a hole, but now, he was disappointed by their inability to perform such a seemingly simple task. Navin, standing nearby, eagerly raised his hand, wanting to give it a shot, but before he could step forward, the protagonist, Jae-hwan, approached the workbench. Navin, startled, tried to intervene, warning him to stay back since outsiders weren't allowed to interfere. However, Jae-hwan ignored the caution and, instead, calmly asked Michael if he could give it a try. The apprentices and even Michael stared at him, curious and skeptical. They began to whisper among themselves, wondering if Jae-hwan was a traveling blacksmith or artisan who thought he could handle the beast's horn. Michael, unsure where this stranger had come from, looked him up and down, doubting his ability. "You think you can do what my workers couldn't? You're sorely mistaken if you believe this is simple," Michael said with a smirk. Jae-hwan, still unfazed, simply asked, "Where do you want the hole?" and pointed at the sword. Michael explained that it wasn't the apprentices' fault, they were skilled, but the four-horned beast's horn was notoriously difficult to shape, even for experienced blacksmiths. It required immense strength and precision, both of which were rare. Ignoring the explanation, Jae-hwan placed his finger on the horn. Suddenly, a wave of force radiated from the point of contact, sending a shockwave through the room that pushed Michael back. Everyone gasped as Jae-hwan, with no visible effort, began to drill a hole into the horn using nothing but his finger. As the horn spun effortlessly around his finger, Jae-hwan turned to Michael and casually asked, "Does this mean I'm the deputy blacksmith for the day?" Before Michael could even process what was happening, the sword cracked and shattered into pieces, scattering shards across the room. The apprentices stood frozen in shock, and Michael was left speechless. Breaking a horn like that was supposed to be impossible. Jae-hwan, realizing what he had done, apologized sincerely, admitting it was an accident. However, Michael, furious beyond words, cursed under his breath and charged at Jae-hwan, ready to attack. His apprentices quickly rushed to restrain him, holding him back before he could lash out. The frustration in Michael's eyes was palpable, but the display of raw power had left everyone in awe of Jae-hwan's strange and overwhelming abilities. The deputy blacksmith stared at the protagonist in disbelief, trying to process what had just happened. "Is that all you have to say? Are you out of your mind?" he growled, the frustration evident in his voice. His eyes narrowed as he demanded, "Do you even know how valuable those horns are?" Jae-hwan, completely unfazed, casually replied, "I was trying to be gentle." Navin and Mino exchanged bewildered glances, utterly speechless. Gentle? He had still managed to destroy the dagger without a second thought. Jae-hwan, showing no sign of guilt, looked at the shattered pieces and remarked, "I see now, it's not that hard to break the horn entirely. The real challenge is breaking it properly." Though his words seemed insincere, he still offered a half-hearted apology. This only made Michael's blood boil. Gritting his teeth, he grabbed Jae-hwan by the collar and spat, "Do you think an apology can fix this? Do you know how much that horn was worth? You've just destroyed a four-horned beast's horn, worth a fortune. And now you think you can run this place for a day?" Despite Michael's anger, Jae-hwan remained calm. "I'll give you something better to make up for it," he said confidently. Michael scoffed, his disbelief apparent. "You? A bum like you? What could you possibly have that's better than a four-horned beast's horn? Without hesitation, Jae-hwan reached into his bag and pulled out something that left the room stunned, a horn from a five-horned beast. He handed it to Michael, who froze in shock. "This is a five-horned beast's horn. Is it better than the last one?" Jae-hwan asked casually. The entire smithy fell silent as they realized the rarity of what they were seeing. The workers murmured in amazement. This was a horn from a beast known as Garnak, a creature almost impossible to hunt. Michael's eyes widened in disbelief. Is this a genuine Garnak horn?" Jae-hwan shrugged. "I hope this covers the loss. I don't have any more of those four-horned beast horns, or whatever you called them." Michael, still stunned, nodded slowly. This more than makes up for it." Jae-hwan smirked and asked, "So, can I use your smithy now?" Michael turned to his apprentices and instructed them to close the shop doors. Without hesitation, they followed his orders, placing a closed sign at the entrance of the Twilight Smithy. As they finished, Michael led Jae-hwan into the heart of the workshop. Seeing everything under control, Mino decided to slip away for a quick errand and told Jae-hwan to start without her. Once inside, Michael proudly introduced the place. "This is Twilight Smithy, the finest in Gorgon. We've got the best tools and craftsmen in the city. Feel free to use whatever you need, Deputy Blacksmith," he said with a slight grin. Jae-hwan thanked him for the generosity. Curiosity getting the best of him, Michael asked, "Where did you even find a Garnak horn?" Jae-hwan removed his cape and answered casually, "I took it down myself." Michael's eyes widened in disbelief. "You killed a five-horned beast on your own?" Jae-hwan nodded, explaining, "Yeah, one of them attacked me while I was traveling." Michael couldn't hide his amazement. Very few people in Gorgon, let alone the chaotic wilderness surrounding it, had the strength or skill to defeat such a creature. "Impressive," he muttered under his breath. Jae-hwan put on an apron and then asked Michael for some assistance. "I need help making a sheath. Never made one from scratch before, though I've repaired a few." Michael blinked in surprise. A sheath from a five-horned beast's horn? His thoughts raced. What kind of sword was Jae-hwan planning to pair with such a high-quality material? It seemed like overkill. As Jae-hwan revealed his sword, Michael's jaw nearly dropped. The blade shimmered with an otherworldly glow, and for a moment, he thought it resembled a legendary frostworm blade, though he assumed it was just a well-crafted replica. The craftsmanship was impeccable, and the sword was undeniably beautiful, but using a Garnak horn for a sheath? Michael thought that was too much. Wouldn't it be better to forge an entirely new sword with the horn instead? Michael suggested, still trying to wrap his head around the situation. Before he could say more, something strange happened. The sword began to tremble in Michael's hand, and to his utter shock, the blade seemed to come alive. It opened its mouth as if ready to devour something. Michael froze, staring in disbelief. What is this sword?" he muttered, eyes wide with amazement. The sword suddenly devoured the five-horned beast's horn, sending a small fragment flying straight into Michael's face. He stood there, speechless, as it dawned on him that the weapon was, in fact, a real spirit sword. He could feel its powerful energy radiating off it and quickly realized that it must be inhabited by the soul of a much higher-level entity. But how had such a soul found its way into this sword? That was beyond him. As he watched the blade begin to evolve, shifting and growing in both size and complexity, Michael understood this was no ordinary transformation. The sword was undergoing a significant evolution right before his eyes. When the process was complete, Michael turned to Jae-hwan and informed him that the sword would need a new name. Confused, Jae-hwan asked, "A new name?" Michael explained, "Spirit weapons lose their original names after evolving significantly. You'll need to give it a new one." Jae-hwan frowned, eyeing his sword suspiciously. "If it keeps eating things without my permission, I'm going to call it Pig Sword." Despite the odd complaint, Jae-hwan seemed unfazed by the sword's behavior. After all, he still had another five-horned beast horn. Michael blinked in surprise, unable to comprehend how Jae-hwan had another one. He then remembered it was a five-horned beast, which meant there must have been multiple horns. A realization hit him like a brick. Was Jae-hwan carrying all the horns? With disbelief still lingering, Michael asked, "So, how can I help?" Jae-hwan looked over at him. "I'd like to see you work." Feeling the pressure to perform, Michael nodded and asked if Jae-hwan had any particular design in mind for shaping his shield. Jae-hwan shrugged and said, "I'll let you decide since you're the expert." The weight of expectation settled on Michael's shoulders, but he accepted the challenge. "All right, then. I'll show you the daybreak craftsman skill." As Michael prepared to get started, the scene shifted to the inner castle of Gorgon. A man stood before his superior, apologizing profusely. "After Jae-hwan killed those street thugs, I lost track of the target," he explained. Jürgen Cheever, the Prime Minister of Gorgon, calmly sipped his tea and then, to the man's surprise, asked, "How did you even find him?" The man hesitated, clearly unsure. I'm not sure. When I regained consciousness, I was lying on a rooftop, he admitted, baffled by his own experience. The Prime Minister's eyes widened in disbelief. Jae-hwan had seen through the advanced cloaking of a third-stage adapted player, a technique reserved for those with master-level skills. That could only mean one thing: Jae-hwan was at least a fifth-stage adapted player. The realization hit hard, and Jurgen immediately ordered his subordinate to gather a team and comb through the city, leaving no stone unturned. The subordinate nodded and hurried off to execute the orders. As soon as he was alone, a sharp pain shot through Jurgen's head. He winced, rubbing his temples as the vibrations intensified, and the room around him began to tremble. Frustrated, he slammed his fist onto the table. "Just a little longer," he muttered, addressing his unseen lord. "We'll find a solution soon enough." Meanwhile, at a bustling bar in the city, an announcement echoed through the room, grabbing everyone's attention. A young woman on a screen, recapping the week's top 10 players with a cheerful siren tone. After finishing the list, she yawned and apologized to the crowd. "That's all for today, folks. But before we wrap up, I've got something special for you, a clip that I'm sure most of you are already familiar with." The patrons murmured excitedly as she queued up the video, the hottest one on Little Brother at the moment. The screen flickered to life, showing the legendary footage of a player on the 99th floor of the tower, battling an enormous ice dragon. The crowd went silent, mesmerized by the fight. The player's face had been blurred, preserving their anonymity, but the skill and precision in the battle were unmistakable. Everyone in the bar was buzzing with questions. What had happened to that player? Rumors swirled that the tower's masters were desperate to get their hands on him. One man at the back scoffed, leaning over to his companion. "You haven't heard, have you? They've stopped cultivating that tower entirely." The others turned in shock, demanding to know why. That's it for today. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more. We'll see you in the next one.